Hello. Thank you everyone for joining today's open learning session, Organising in Place and Working Across Altitudes. My name is Athanasia from Social Enterprise Australia, and thinking about enablers for collaboration is something that I am particularly excited about. So thank you. Now, we host these sessions as part of the Social Enterprise Development Initiative, funded by the Federal Department of Social Services. So our aim is to hold spaces where a variety of people all the way across the social enterprise community and related networks can share what they know, what they're learning, to help strengthen connection and hopefully continue momentum towards these shared goals that we're all working to. Today's session is convened by Regen Labs in collaboration with Regen Melbourne. Before I hand over, I'll acknowledge that I'm thankful to be on beautiful Quandamooka country, which you can see in my background. Pay my respects to elders past and present, recognise their continuing connection to the waters, skies, the lands that we all have the privilege of living and working on. I also pay respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander participants joining today, recognising that your participation brings 65,000 years of systems thinking and relational care for people, place and planet. And we understand that in all of our work, whether we're a peak body, intermediary, social enterprise, researcher, funder, that we all have opportunities and responsibilities to take actions that demonstrate value for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories, cultures, and futures, and contribute to equity and justice as part of our everyday work. So for us, that means learning, unlearning, making mistakes, and practicing every day as we're trying to do at Social Enterprise Australia. And now, without further ado, it's a real pleasure to be joined by Dimity Podger from Regen Labs and Nicole Barling-Luke from Regen Melbourne. Thank you both.
Thanks so much for such a warm welcome and really great to be here with you all. We're super pleased to be joining you for this open learning session and share insights from Weave, the Regen Economy Systems Lab, which is an innovation collaboration learning community commissioned by Social Enterprise Australia as part of the SETI program from the government. I'm Dimity, I'm a co-founder of Regen Labs and convener of Weave, and I'm joining you from Darawal country and pay my respects to elders past and present. It's my pleasure to introduce our Weave learning partner, Nicole Barling-Luke, Director of Earthshots with Regen Melbourne, and bringing learning around organising for change from an urban environment, Melbourne, a beautiful capital city, together with Regen Labs working at a national level with regional enterprises in regional places. So our work has a very connected agenda, and you'll see this from our stories that we'll share with you today, but it's also different. So let's get into it, and over to you, Nick, to set the scene.
Thanks, everyone. I'm joining from the beautiful Wurundjeri country today, down here in Melbourne. So, as mentioned, this is a learning session. So we just wanted to start a bit of a conversation about some of the things that we've been learning, both here in an urban context in Melbourne, but also where are the patterns of that showing up in other places. And I wanted to start here. I'm not sure if anyone has ever had this feeling. Feel free to reflect on what that might feel like for you. But one of the challenging things we often find when working in this grand system space is moving between altitudes. So what does it mean to look at where, for example, affordable fresh food might be found in different suburbs in Melbourne, and how does that connect to our supply chains regionally and nationally? How does that connect to our future food resilience? How does that connect to the shocks that we're seeing now and are going to see in the future? But also, how does that food connect to our cultural sense of belonging that we have on our tables every meal that we're having when we're sharing food with friends and family? So, all of those layers are in a conversation at any time when you're thinking about the food system. And so we sometimes call that altitude sickness. So this idea that when you're in a mountain climbing example of gaining or reducing altitude too quickly, and the body hasn't had enough time to adjust to those conditions. And I think often, when we're working in these really complex spaces, it can feel a little bit like the body or the brain hasn't had time to adjust to the layers and the conditions that we're trying to accommodate in any given time, because it is so complex and interconnected. So that's what we mean by working across altitudes. Where are we kind of seeing these different layers of the system? And so we've kind of been thinking about some kind of maps that we might use to help navigate this feeling, so we don't all look like the cat every day. So what we're going to kind of work through is one framework that we've found useful to help orient where we are at any given time, but also use that as a way to kind of share some really exciting work that we're seeing emerge from our places here. So as I said, this is one framework. There are so many incredible frameworks out there. I know Understory have a lot of them, but this one in particular we drew out because I do think it's quite an accessible way, whether you're new to the systems world or you've been in it for a while, to kind of ground and return to these different entry points of what it means to do complex work. So some of you might have seen this before. If you haven't, welcome. It's adapted from the Giles transition model, which some of you might have seen. This adaptation is done by Charlie Leadbeater and Jenny Winhall. And there's a link in there too that kind of explains it in more depth. And that what they're really looking at is how do systems transition, and how can we think about all the different things that happen at a time when we're kind of transitioning. So one layer or one altitude is thought of as niches, or the microspaces. And this is where people start to develop radical new solutions, new habits, new ways of life that are often responding to local challenges. So it might be many of the activities that you might be working on, those projects that are really just trying to find a solution to a challenge that we're experiencing now. Oftentimes, what we're hoping for is that these niches start to coalesce or form new kernels of an adaptive or an alternative system. So where are we seeing these projects or opportunities of like, oh, that's the future I want to see? And it just might be happening down your street, on your street, in the neighborhood next door. Where is that pocket of the new future starting to emerge? But we have this other altitude, which is the landscape level, so that macro layer. So this is where we see our societal values, culture, political ideologies, trends, economic patterns. Now, changes at this level, at the landscape level, and changes at the micro level, so where these niches are emerge, they don't necessarily change a system, they don't transition a system, but they create the context and the opportunity to do so, because they create the conditions for this meso layer, this regime layer to change. And so that's where we see the institutions, technologies, markets, and organizations that give structure to a system. This is where we kind of are looking for that systems transition. Where do new ways of working get embedded? Where do new conditions, where do new incentives get created that are enduring? And that might be the type of thing that we're looking for in a systems transition. So those are like three broad altitudes we like to think of that need to be working in complementary ways if we're to ask, or if we're to see how this systems might transition. So you kind of want to be seeing, where are those niche levels gaining momentum? Where is the landscape creating a new window of opportunity? And where is the regime starting to be able to respond to both the pressure that's coming from the macro and those new ideas that are coming from the micro? Again, some of you might have been familiar with that framework, some might not be, but we like to think of that as one way to orient ourselves to different altitudes. And what both Dimity and I are going to talk through is how we kind of think about that in the context of our work. Where is it helpful to think about it as a map, and where does it start to coalesce all at once, all the time, and then we start to feel like that cat again, being quite lost. So this is how you can see this happening over time. Hopefully you can see this blue arrow as well. We've got this macro layer of the landscape. There is either pressure or opportunity created that can start to influence this meso level. And importantly, you have these niches kind of creating a sense of momentum, or there is something that kind of breaks through into that mesolayer. So if we think of this as a bit of a map for our conversation, how can we orient ourselves on these different altitudes? So in the context of Regen Melbourne's work, yes, let's navigate the map. So as mentioned, we're a not-for-profit working down here in Greater Melbourne. We are in service to our place. We often say the client is Greater Melbourne. And we've been around for about 5 years, and think of ourselves as a place-based intermediary, if you will. So where are the places in the system of this beautiful living and breathing city that need new flows, whether that's resources, whether that's ideas, whether that's new collaborations? How can we create new flows in service to what this place would like to happen for itself? So in the context of that landscape level, our origin story was really at the crisis, the double crisis of the Black Summer fires, and then immediately followed by the COVID lockdown, where we saw all the consequences of an unequal economy come to the surface. So people experienced COVID lockdown fundamentally differently, depending if they had safe income, depending where they lived in the city. So all these cracks in our economic system really came to the fore, and that was on the back of that ecological crisis where we saw smoke sitting in the city for the first time. So it was really a moment for, a city itself to have a sense of identity, because we really understood where the boundary of Greater Melbourne was. It was a sense of identity, but also recognizing that this economy that we have is not working for everyone. There are only a few that this is serving, but if we look across our city, which is a beautiful, privileged place in many regards, there are many places where it is not serving, and it is not serving people equally. So there's this pressure, we're all feeling it. And, it's interesting to think about 5 years ago what we were feeling, but actually what we're feeling now, and you can see it in the streets, people are really feeling this pressure that this economic system we have is not serving everyone. And at the same time, there are windows of opportunity at that landscape level. There are windows of opportunity emerging around what a well-being economy could look like. What is a different way of organizing the system that we kind of have assumed? There is the economy has felt like it's in the realm of the experts. Only a couple of people really understand how it works, and it's very smoke and mirrors. Well, no, we work with Kate Rayworth, who is an economist based in the UK, looking around donut economics. And she says, the most interesting tool that you can have when thinking about the economy is a pen or a pencil, because it means you can redesign it. It was designed in the first instance, so what does it look like to redesign it? And so in a very simple way, and again, some of you might be familiar with donut economics. For those not, I'll very quickly introduce it. But often we think about the economy as this line, this line that has to go up, growth. It must grow. But why is that the shape? Why is that the shape of how we think about our economy? What if it looks like a donut, where you have this green space in the middle, this safe and just space where we're thriving, where there's a regenerative sense of place and belonging, both for our place, but also for the whole planet. And what you see in this framework is on the inside, you've got your social foundations. So there's things like food, health, education, water, belonging, mobility, all the things that you might need to thrive as a society. And then on the outside, you've got your planetary boundaries. So these are the things like climate change, air pollution, biodiversity loss, land conversion. And what we're seeing here in the red is that we have transgressed our planetary boundaries. We have overshot what this living planet can handle. We have put too much pressure on the planet. And also what you can see on the inside is that we have fallen short of our social foundations. Not everybody has what they need to thrive. And so what would it look like? This is Kate's proposition of how we could think about a new economy. What would it look like to live in this dough of the donut, that green space where we're not overshooting, but we're also not falling short? This came about at the same time that Regen Melbourne was kind of emerging, when we're continuing to feel these like economic pressures but also start to have new conversations about how it might be that we could organize an economy. Donut economics is one of many in this wellbeing economy space. I think it can be a really useful tool to kind of have an entry point into both a really big altitude of the economy, but also quite an accessible one. Because if you're just thinking about this little wedge here, which is food, what does our food system look like here in Greater Melbourne, and how does that actually connect to the broader, altitudes at play? So that might have been a bit of a quick run through of multiple different altitudes at once. But when we return to this map, that's some of the tools that we're thinking about at this macro layer. What does it look like to see that new window of opportunity of the landscape level? What would it look like to actually redesign or rethink about where our economy is heading, where we're centering life, not growth? Just to check in with the body, because we're about to change altitudes, we're going to go down now to this niche layer. So what does it look like? I'm sure many of you on this call are working in amazing spaces that are kind of creating these alternative systems, like on the ground, in your communities, in places. So what does that look like, and what are the shapes we're seeing there? One of many examples that I could have called on here, it was incredibly hard to pick actually, but one that I wanted to pull out was this project that we're working on with the Wellbeing Protocol and over 10 community groups across Greater Melbourne is a distributed grant making pilot that we've been working on. So on the surface, essentially it's an app really that has been developed by the Wellbeing Protocol. And what it does is create a space for democratic participation in a different way by channeling local ideas connected with a vision for the place, decided by the people who live in that place. And then that can channel and connect funding through it that's distributed untied. So the people of the place are deciding where that money should flow. So we're working with about 10 community organisations across Greater Melbourne who are working on such different things in their own spaces, responding to their local needs, because they are the best suited. They know what needs to happen in their community, whether that is a biodiversity initiative or working with people at risk. They know what their local solutions need to look like. And what this is about is like, how do we create a funding mechanism that can change the power dynamics of having to apply for a grant, for instance, but instead of recognizing and responding to the community-led knowledge that they have of their place and what it is to kind of make that thrive. Yes, that's, again, a small niche, you could say. It's not a new idea, but what we're looking at is how you could work across a network of these community groups to show demand for that type of funding and for this type of hyper-local organising as one of many, many niches that are emerging around different types of community-led change, different types of democratic participation, and different types of funding flows. We could have stayed here at the niche level for a long time because there are so many interesting activities happening across Greater Melbourne. It's both inspiring and somewhat exhausting because it's a lot of activity. Okay, we're whizzing through this map. What I wanted to do is look at this kind of final altitude layer, which can often be, systems work is challenging for everyone. I think everyone on this call would know that. But this one can be the challenging bit of like, how do we create enough window of opportunity at the landscape layer and enough momentum and coherence of these niches to kind of join up in a strategic way to kind of hit that meso, those structures of the system. Something that we're working on here at Regen Melbourne and across the city to kind of see how can we scaffold that transition from all these incredible niches, but like how do we scaffold them into how the current system is structured, the deep code of how we kind of organize ourselves. What is something that kind of can intersect with that and actually change some of the patterns of how decisions are being made at the moment? Our response to this meso level is what we call Earthshots. So you might think of a moonshot, which is when, they said, we are going to the moon, and they didn't know how, but they made that bold statement. And by doing so, all these different ways of organizing were created. There was new innovations, new markets were created, new ways of collaborating, whole industries emerged in order to kind of channel behind that goal. Now, we are not interested in colonizing space or going to the moon. We are interested in working in our place here as an Earthshot. So what would it look like to put out these wildly ambitious goals and then say, we don't know how to get there, but by putting out that declaration, how might we organize ourselves differently in service to what that goal is? So we could think of these Earthshots in lots of different ways. But when thinking about, that map that we're looking at, how can we think of them as coherence-making mechanisms? How can it be a way to kind of create momentum of both the niches, but also responding to the context at that landscape level to kind of break through of how that meso layer is working? So I'll step through a couple of elements of these Earthshots. So we can kind of think about how they're designed. I think we're seeing a lot of promise in how they might be interacting with the current system, but it's a bit of a gamble right now to see if these actually can break into the way our current system is operating. I'll break down a number of elements because I think this is instructive. These are the hypotheses of what we've put together to see if it can kind of break into that current system. So the first layer is a declaration of intent. So one of our Earthshots is making the Yarra Birrarung swimmable again. A, because we love swimming, sure, but B, that's a Trojan horse. So if that river was healthy and thriving again, the whole city would be healthy and thriving. So for that to happen, so many parts of our system would have to change in order to make it possible. So how do we use the bold goal of a swimmable Birrarung as a multi-solver? Because there would have to be improvements in river health. Our cultural relationship with the story of that river would have to change. So many things would be at play that is kind of nested under that grand challenge. It's also an ecosystem response. There's not going to be one single thing that happens as the result of one organization that makes that river swimmable. It is an entire city response. You've got engineers creating technical solutions around stormwater. We've also got, the advocates who have been, working on this type of initiative for years and decades to recognize that a healthy river is a healthy city. You've got your legal teams who are working with, the landmark legislation that we have here that recognizes the Birrarung as a living entity. So what does it mean to put that in practice? What does it mean for the state government who already do great care of their waterways to align this in a more strategic way to the friends of groups who are already caring for the waterways, in their backyards? That's another layer. The third layer is, we kind of create these nested system boundaries for multiple entry points. So just as I said that it's an ecosystem response, there are also these, transition pathways, we call them, to break down the challenge to say, okay, well, yes, it's going to take a whole ecosystem, but how can we create some coherence about the pathways that we have ahead so that they can be playing in their own rhythm, at their own time, at their own pace, but still working towards this grand goal and have a sense of coherence about what is being created, not necessarily a sense of coordination. And so we find those transition pathways are quite helpful at that coherence layer. And then, of course, we have what we would call projects, a portfolio of projects. But in this context, it's interesting to think about that as a portfolio of niches. So all those niches that are already underway, what does that look like to come together in like a strategic portfolio? So across our work at Regen Melbourne, whether that's in the Earthshots or the systems lab we work with, I think we have over 32 of these projects that are really looking at what are the things that we are seeing in the city and how can they be kind of like a collective learning vehicle, for more aggregated impact, you could say. Okay, I've still got time to use an example. So thinking about how that kind of portfolio of niches would actually start to intersect with the layers of our system as we understand them, we both want to be looking at the narrative. So what is the story of the river? What are the story of our streets here in Greater Melbourne? What are the stories of our food system and how we connect to food? But we also want to look at levers like policy, regulation, our legal system. In the work that we do across our streets, it seems like a small lever to pull, but the different types of rules around verge planting and how we can support community-owned responses, to create more biodiversity in their place, in combination with how we might rethink how public liability currently works, which is a real barrier to how community groups are currently able to care for the spaces that they live and work and play in. So, both across these grand goals, where are we looking at those enabling functions, like simple things? How do we plant in our verge? How do we shut down our street so we can have a street party? And how do we as a community organisation go and care for the place without, having a terrifying bill around public liability? Where are those levers that we're also pulling in that portfolio of niches as a way to embed a new way of doing things in how decisions are currently getting made? That was a very quick map dive. Very happy to go deeper or zoom out. It would be great to hear how people are, if that all makes sense as an attempt to understand the map. What is one way for us to think about all these different altitudes we fling across? And I will stop talking because that was far too much of my voice.
Not at all, Nick, not at all. I think it's great to work with a framework like this, and thanks so much for really articulating these different levels that you're working at. One of the things that we learned, Nick and I, as we were working with this framework is, this is a framework that Regen Melbourne uses a lot, and through this learning partnership, I've had the opportunity of sort of working with it to explain and understand the Regen Labs story. So it's super cool, and thanks so much, Nick, for explaining that and bringing to life all of the different frameworks that you use and the projects and programs that have been evolving over a period of time. So very well done. So it's my turn now to navigate the map. It really has helped us in our thinking around what have been the macro conditions or conditions at that macro altitude that has helped some of the niches form that we're working in now, and also think about what's happening at that meso altitude in the middle that are either challenges or blockages or enablers of some of the niches that we're working with. And I'm going to share the story of how Regen Labs came about through using these three altitudes. So similarly, the landscape level shock of the terrible bushfires, in a similar way, a large organisation response, WWF Australia's response, and then the opening there to form niches in terms of the Innovate to Regenerate challenge, and also barriers and gaps that were still there at the meso level, and then Regen Labs forming to really respond to those shocks, as well as trying to address the gap. And we all really remember that at the landscape level, at this macro level, that the devastating bushfires followed by floods and COVID had just such a massive effect. What it did highlight for us was, regional communities were really bearing the brunt of these climate shocks, and also leading the recovery, particularly through multiple niche innovations, which was very exciting to see with community-led solutions. And that, those macro conditions and this grassroots response led to a lot of capital coming into WWF Australia, which is really receiving a flow of funds for bushfire recovery. And so the reason why I talk about WWF Australia is that our team who co-founded Regen Labs, that's where we were working. So Reese Proudfoot was leading the Innovate to Regenerate Challenge, and myself, I came a bit later in the project, joined the Regenerative Communities portfolio, and Phil Freeman, also a co-founder and on the call, he was involved in helping set up Panda Labs, where Innovate to Regenerate sort of sat within WWF, and another member of our team as well. And so WWF received all these funds, and there was this growing challenge of climate disruptions, as well as alongside this recognition of the need for new economic patterns, which Nick has explained. And so WWF took that opportunity to embark on a national strategy to regenerate Australia and invest in niche level innovation. So that included the Innovate to Regenerate campaign and challenge. And really the focus there was to try and catalyse a shift to a regenerative economy through activations at that niche level. It involved supporting regional community-led regenerative initiatives and enterprises. And with this wonderful team, and partnerships with other organisations, including Regen Studios, it involved a number of different elements. So a film to awaken grassroots communities, workshops to surface ideas, local learning labs to incubate those ideas, and seed funding to finance them. With all of that, though, there were still barriers that were at that level, at the meso level. Specifically, we were learning that the right type of capital wasn't flowing to these enterprises. There were structural challenges as well as awareness challenges, and also sort of a lack of understanding of what these enterprises were really doing in terms of healing the commons. And we also learned that enterprises themselves, these regenerative enterprises, needed further capability building support, connection into innovation ecosystems. And so we really learned that there was still a lot more to do. So when the Innovate to Regenerate program finished at WWF in 2023, Regen Labs was launched to continue the work to try and break through to that meso level. It's really fun actually to use this language, Nick. So Regen Labs has sort of taken on this bold vision of partnering with regional enterprises and local ecosystem partners to catalyse the shift to a community and nature-serving economy. And this is an image that helps us think about what we mean and to explain what we mean by that to others. So at a community level, what's an interconnected system of enterprises across sectors working deeply in place for the regeneration of those places. So if we come back to the map and move to that niche level again, our work in response to this meso level challenge for enterprises and funders has been to develop two niche innovations. The first is the Regen Community Investment Fund, and the second being the Regen Economy Activator Program. And so together, these niche innovations are looking at that systemic gap between enterprises needing the right support and the right finance, and investors, including government, wanting pathways to invest for change. And we're innovating at this niche altitude to build new systems, structures, cultures of thinking and doing, creating new coalitions and alliances, and attempting to make some shifts and create new structures that can exist in a more stable way at that meso level. And whilst a fund is not a new thing, a fund isn't an innovation or incubators, what we have done is co-design these side by side, and doing it with place-based enterprises, First Nations community and enterprise leaders, and ecosystem partners and funders, to try and influence and design for these multiple altitudes within these niche innovations. And the fund and what we lovingly call the Regen Economy Activator Program, the REAP, together they're increasing access of place-based portfolios of enterprises to the right kind of capital. And they also help investors either from within a place or from outside a place to find impactful enterprises and contribute to blend their finance for greater impact. So if we come back to the map, what we're experiencing now a few years on is at the same time as that we're doing this work at the niche level, is that there is an emerging alignment at the macro altitude as well, with a growing focus on place-based community-led economic transformation. And this is further enabling opportunities at that niche altitude. The conditions are there for us to multiply and expand what we're doing at the niche level. And this is where Weave comes in, which is the program supported by Social Enterprise Australia. And it's an opportunity for us to learn together and create coherence for the niches and the innovations happening at the grassroots, and trying to shift that mesostructure through this shared learning kind of context. So we're convening the lab to share insights, learn from one another and other initiatives happening in different parts of the system. So Regen Melbourne, for example, and also our partner, Ready Communities, and other place-based partners. And so we're bringing together different parts of the system to learn really across 3 domains: business model innovation, social infrastructure, and finance innovation, and to amplify that learning to influence strategic intervention points and try and influence the current regime, and connecting up the innovations at the place level. So in a nutshell, I'll just give you a brief overview. Weave is a platform or a scaffold to move learning forward, build collaboration infrastructure. And we are sort of trying to join up the niches and the innovations to try and that are enabled by that macro condition to create more opportunities for the right flow of finance and capital to enterprises, and to grow innovation ecosystems in places, and then learn more about doing that. I will leave it there and get back to you, Nick.
Thanks, Dimity. So, and I can see one really great question in there, and we have some that people pre-sent when they signed up, so we can have a good chat about things that are coming up. Yeah, I guess we did just want to land on some reflections from how, as Dimity says, like, we've been practicing this language. Where is it useful to think about this? Where does it create too much like mechanical thinking about what layer are you at, and where is it actually quite a helpful map to think about where are we in a transition, both like in the work that I am in immediately, but also the bigger picture, and how do we help orient ourselves to that. So a couple of reflections from what we would say is the messy middles of change, of that moment of like, how do these niches kind of align with the meso layer? It's really messy, you know, that's where you get the altitude sickness from. It kind of goes without saying, but we do have to design with all altitudes in mind. So, you know, we call it zoomability. Beck Scott likes to talk about it as like the kite. So like where are you holding onto the ground with the kite, but also where is the kite flying up and seeing a different altitude? I think work that is cognizant of where we are in a moving dynamic system is good. Dimity, you put this one in, which I think is 100% right. Trust and relational capital at any stage of a transition is critical. And I think there was a question that we can come back to that was posted by someone when they signed up, of like, what do you need first? What does good social infrastructure look like in place-based work? And I think both of us would agree that we should not move past trust and relational capital. Yeah, and something we were also reflecting on is that, you know, these altitudes are not equal in their resilience. That might feel obvious to say, but, you know, niches by nature are sometimes precarious, or sometimes, you know, set at a particular scale. And that mesostructure is really sticky. It's there because it's been stabilized. So an ability to bounce back or break through is not equal for all these altitudes. Do you want to speak to the next one?
Absolutely, Nick. Yeah, it's an interesting one where, and the 2 next ones come together. We were thinking about our reflection on ways that you can bake in enabling conditions into the authorising environment. So, for example, in the Southern Highlands, where we're working with the Highlands Homegrown Economy, and it's a group of partners. One of the things Reese has focused on as well is baking in this idea of a regenerative economy into the community management plans within local government. So the language is there, then we have to figure out how to do it. But it's a way of baking in a concept and a way of thinking about economy and planning for the future. So that's one way of thinking about baking in, and to also know that that may compromise niches that are needed for further growth and development. So being mindful not to impose a structure too soon, I guess, in these transitions is important. And which probably leads to the final one. There are always more niches. And so there's a culture of being comfortable that we need to evolve the systems that we have, that they do stabilize, and that they still need to evolve. So being comfortable with niches, that there is importance for innovation, and that is important to support.
Beautiful.
Anything else you wanted to add, Nick?
No, I think it's nice to end on there are always more niches, because that perhaps beautifully segues. There's a question in the chat around, does it take a significant landscape shift or that macro disalignment for community to be activated? Or can communities be activated otherwise? Like, does it always have to come from a disalignment or alignment? And I think that's a great question, and you probably are quite well placed to reflect on that, Dimity.
It's both, I guess. So one thing that, emerged for us with Regen Labs is that we came out of something that had already been a response to a calamity, and that provided conditions. Kate Raworth visited Australia and provided a more proactive way of thinking about the economy. So there was the shock, that kind of disalignment, as well as, oh, well, there's other ways of thinking about economy and we can proactively evolve in that way. I think for some of the work that we're doing, we're trying to share what we're learning so that other communities can also proactively move forward without necessarily a burning platform. We do have a burning platform, I think, in many respects. And if you can develop that culture of innovation and proactive and initiative-based cultures, entrepreneurial cultures, then perhaps we can move to the future with less shock. But it's both, yes and.
Yes, and yeah, I agree, and I think I'm trying to think of if there's any more place-based stories I can tell to bring this to life, but none are coming to mind, because yeah, I think what that like map that we use today, it kind of shows quite like a neat timeline, as if niches are growing and then there's momentum and that lines up with disalignment, and it's like that's a nice way to visualize a temporal scale that I don't think always aligns that way. And I think a lot of communities always activate themselves. They are always creating niches. They are always designing and bringing to life stories that they need to kind of work and live in the way that they want to work and live. And so I think that is going on, and just the neatness of that map kind of shows a catalytic moment of when that lines up with disalignment, but certainly not the only catalytic moment. So yeah, I agree.
Oh, sorry. Did someone come off mute?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring in like more a systemic perspective and wonder whether we could create more of a circular thing than a linear development, because as Dimitri said so rightly, the forces can come in and opportunities can come in at any level. It's really about how you leverage those ones when they come, which you can't predict when they're going to come. Of course, you can create the condition, but sometimes, it's just, as we know, not something predictable. And having more kind of a circular perspective to those three layers, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, it's spirally, it's circular,
it's like I can see the shape of a snail,
yes,
yeah.
It's
And
a
I
great
think
question.
at least it moves us from that linear perspective, which we need to.
Yeah, and I like that you're this distinguishing between innovation or change making. So some of what's happening at the niche level and also other levels is there's organizing happening and organizing for change and capability building and so on. So
I
yeah,
think if we frame it change making, it's much broader than innovation.
right.
Of course, you can innovate at the business level, but when you, from my humble experience, place-based initiatives, they innovate at such a different type of levels that doesn't exist in, like, for example, tech innovation. So if we move away from innovation, it's actually less reductive, I would say. Change making for me is more appropriate because we are really trying to enact a change, to create something different in the system, not just creating a solution. I don't know.
No. I really like that distinction. And I think there's something you said just there that picks up as well around like, place also collapses systems, right? So like taking that place-based approach, you can't make a perfect
Exactly.
diagram. You can't altitudes because like it is a living, breathing, it's 3D, it's alive, it has a history. So like kind of reach the limit of a linear framework as soon as you're talking about a place. You can have tools to kind of invite people in who might not have, that can be a really somatically scary thing to all of a sudden have your systems collapsed into a place.
I think this question that's in the chat as well here from Athanasia, what does it take in terms of time invested learning processes and infrastructure to get to the places you are now? And I think that's a question you'd be well placed to answer as well. It does take time. Maybe some thoughts on that, Nick, from Regen Melbourne's experience.
Like, how do we even measure time, right? I think it's really neat to tell a story of the last 5 years from an organizational perspective. We were born out of crisis, and then we organized ourselves in a particular way for a couple of years and had this iterative strategy. There were lots of different formations of how we organized our team, how we were funded, like all that kind of like grew. That has a very neat evolution to it in hindsight. But all of that was already emerging out of existing relationships, existing partnerships, existing initiatives that had been born and that had died, as always happens. Alison, who's been our reading list collaborator, used to work at Resilient Melbourne, which was this initiative that, was born and then died in its own way. And so, although was reformed rather. So I guess what I'm trying to say with that there is an enormous amount of time that is invested to build what we might say is social infrastructure. What are the scaffolds? What are the handholds we can have to work together? But all of that exists on so much time that was invested even before the investment of our time. That said, I would say one more thing in that both having an emergent organic response to what a place wants to evolve into, as well as having quite a strategic response as well, is where I think the effort often goes to. So like we do set ourselves up in such a way that there is like a scaffold that can contain and can hold and can direct forward some of the work that we're doing. And I think that has been set up in a very like strategic way that no, we didn't know that's what we were going to do 5 years ago, but it is what we're doing. Like you can actually track that. So in terms of the learning processes, they're very iterative. We have internal practices as a team. We also have like lots of conversations and collaborations like this that keep the learning cycles really live, whether that's at the national, regional, conversations with Regen Labs, where it's at the international conversations with DEAL, the Donut Economics Action Lab team, so the altitudes are shifting in our learning processes all the time as well. And I think there actually is a lot of like structured strategy that sits behind it too. That was a long response to a short question.
If I was to talk about one of the pathways of learning within Weave, one of the ways that we're learning is convening place-based conveners in different places across Australia in kind of an action learning approach. and folks involved include Liz Sanders and Matthew Wright-Simon from the Hills and Coasts in Adelaide, and they're learning about different things. So how do you convene a wisdom circle of stakeholders at the system level, as in government and funders and ecologists, and in particular First Nations supervisors of a program of enterprises trying to collaborate for impact in their place. So we're learning about that. Liz is learning about how do you convene and activate a whole food system in a region. We're also working with Paula Williams in Northern Rivers around a coalition, a Northern Rivers Food Coalition, to activate pathways for enterprises, as well as a holistic food strategy that is that's at play in good times and bad. And then in the Shoalhaven and Kangaroo Valley, Tim Collins and Miki Kavari are learning about local food co-ops. And then in the Southern Highlands, we are activating around a homegrown Highlands economy, which is a convening of enterprises and ecosystem partners. So I guess there's learning happening in all different places. And then one way to, I guess, harness or surface what those insights are and share them out is through this action learning journey that we're doing through Weave. There's a bit of an example for you. Any other questions?
Or are we perfectly at time?
Oh, we are. Shall we hand back to you?
Our wonderful hosts.
Our hosts, thanks.
Thank you, both of you. I got a bit cheeky with my own question there at the end. Thank you both. That was fantastic. I love the work that both of your organisations are doing. Really appreciated learning in more detail. I really found that concept of altitude sickness and working across the altitudes really useful for some of the conversations we're right in the thick of. And so I will be back. Thank you also to everyone who joined us here today. A huge thanks to the team at the Department of Social Services who are supporting these learning communities as part of the SEDI initiative. It's been wonderful to be able to share some resources across the social enterprise sector to help people lead these sessions. And finally, thank you to the Social Enterprise Australia crew behind the scenes who helped to put these on. And the real final, which is please check out Understory if you haven't already, which is the place where we host information about the learning communities, including Weave, including recordings from the open learning sessions and a lot others as well. Really appreciate all of you